it's my pleasure to welcome Tristram Travers, who is the CEO of a company called the Hydrogen Utility. You're based in Australia. You've personally a lot of experience, not only in the private, also working in the public sector. Tristram, we look forward to hearing from you about what's happening in Australia.
Good evening, or actually it's not good evening to everyone else, it's good evening from Australia. But welcome to everyone who's joining. And I hope you can see my screen.
It's perfect, yes. We can hear you, we can see you.
That's great. Look, just to put some context around the hydrogen utility, and we're very much a commercial organisation. We're not an industry body or a government organisation or a research organisation, but a commercial enterprise that was founded by myself and Dr. Attilio Piñeri. Now, Attilio is actually the CEO. I'm just an executive director of the business. But the hydrogen utility was formed to commercialise hydrogen deployments in Australia, and the hydrogen utility is a developer, but more importantly, a build, own, and operate developer. And we're a pure play green hydrogen infrastructure focus. So we are using electrolysis powered purely by renewable energy, and the organisation has brought together a very strong executive team from across industry, finance, government, technology, commercialisation, and Attilio actually did his PhD in hydrogen, so we've got quite a lot of technical and financial skills. We have two projects that are quite progressed. One on the Eyre Peninsula, which is a small demonstrator project, if you like. It's 75 megawatts of electrolyser, but the capacity to increase that to 1.8 gigawatts. And another project in Gladstone, Queensland, the northeast of Australia, that has the capacity to go to around 3 gigawatts. And we're currently exploring two other projects in Tasmania and New Zealand. So why are we looking at hydrogen from a commercial perspective, and why does it actually work in Australia today? And I think the key driver behind that, which you'll probably all be aware of in the wind industry, is the sustained reduction of costs for both wind and solar. And in Australia, we are very well endowed with some high quality renewable resources, where we're getting very high capacity factors for wind and solar. I mean, we're getting solar sort of getting up towards 30% capacity factors, and we're getting wind well into the 50+%. That gives us some fairly cheap renewable energy, and in some places the cost of renewable energy is getting very, very close to the marginal cost of coal-fired power generation in Australia. And we are also well endowed with fossil fuels in Australia. The other thing that's driving the market outlook for us is that hydrogen as a technology is mature. It's been around for a long time. Electrolysers have been around for 100 years. What's really happening at the moment is the scale up of that technology. And it's no different to where solar panels would have been 20 years ago, when we started to see the scale up of solar. And we do see that as the industry scales rapidly, we'll see a sustained cost reduction in the supply chain costs of electrolysers. And we are starting to see that supply chain expansion as the hydrogen industry matures. The other thing that we're seeing in Australia, particularly on the East Coast, is some sustained increases in natural gas prices due to us putting in some export terminals and Australia basically meeting the North Asia price for gas as opposed to its historic fairly low price for gas. So that's seeing some shifts within the market in Australia. We're also seeing in some of our near neighbours an increased demand for decarbonisation and an increasing need for the importation of essentially green or renewable fuels. We're seeing a need in the renewable energy contribution to the grid, and there's been a lot of conversation in Australia around reliability and security of supply within the grid, and we see that large-scale electrolysers can provide some of that grid balancing solutions that are needed as you get more and more renewables into our national network. And that will give us a much greater level of resilience, both in terms of the power supply, but also in the use of hydrogen as an alternate fuel. So we've looked at the integration of renewables. We've looked at the co-location off-grid. We've looked at the co-location and being grid connected. But we've decided that actually what works best for us is where we can draw on multiple sources of renewables. And that allows us to buffer supply from different technologies and different regions, and the technologies obviously predominantly being solar, wind and hydro for us. And the only way to do that, of course, is to be grid connected. And what we've done in that space is, and this is just part of the grid rules within Australia, is we've become a load and a generator. So we produce hydrogen to make industrial chemicals, but we also use that hydrogen to generate as a peaking plant back into the grid. Now, you know, the engineering purists will tell me, and I must admit I studied engineering, so I can't be too derogatory about engineering purists, but engineering purists will tell us that the round trip efficiency of power to power through hydrogen is not that efficient, somewhere in the order of the high 30%. However, the economic efficiency as a peaking power plant is definitely there when you're using the flexibility of electrolysers to match the intermittency of the renewables, and therefore you're getting your renewable power at an affordable price, or a cheap cost, some might say, that then allows you to generate at a very high price. Now, there's a bit of arbitrage in that on a daily basis, but it's also on a seasonal basis, as John Sheffield pointed out earlier on in his presentation around Power2X. But the other thing that we can do, being grid connected, is we can provide support services to the grid. In particular, fast frequency response, we can provide system strength, we can provide network support and peak generation. Just to give you an example of how we see that operating with our Eyre Peninsula Demonstrator project is, if we look at our prices going from low to high, the green bars you see there is what we call our dispatchable load, and that is essentially the electrolyser. What sits on top of that is a flexible load, which in our case, because we're actually making hydrogen and ammonia, is the other components of the ammonia supply chain, the air separation unit and compressors. And there's a very thin orange line there, which is our critical load, which is the load we need to have at all times, and the blue is our generation capacity. And what you'll see there is that we have the ability to be very flexible within the seconds and milliseconds in terms of turning down the electrolyser, which gives us the ability to provide synthetic inertia or fast frequency response. But it also gives us the ability to make hydrogen when the power prices are very low. And we have a dynamic power pricing structure in Australia. So in the wholesale market, we can buy when the power prices are anything from minus $1,000 a megawatt. And the price will go up to $14,000 a megawatt in some cases in Australia. But it allows us to buy at that very cheap price point. the power, and then turn the electrolyser off. Maintain a very small load till we get to another price point, which is our flexible load, and at that point we've turned down our all our other systems, and then we just maintain the critical load. At the same time as we're turning down, we can turn on our generation units, which are 100% hydrogen fired, get them synchronous with the grid, and then when the price hits a certain price point, we ramp up the generation. So that's essentially the structure to what makes our projects viable. So why are we doing it? I think when we look at decarbonisation globally, there's a very large portion, nearly 40% of our carbon comes from electricity or power. So we've covered just over a third with wind, or potentially we can cover over a third with wind and solar and hydro and other renewable sources. But the balance of our decarbonisation needs is the other 2/3, which is industrial needs, it's chemicals, industrial chemicals, it's energy in terms of gas or heat, it's the mobility markets. And hydrogen, as I think Jürgen pointed out, is the energy vector that crosses all of those. So we can take hydrogen from renewables to make clean fuels, clean chemicals, clean steels, and clean transport. The area that we're focusing on in Australia is actually taking that hydrogen and turning it into ammonia. Now, approximately 1% of the global carbon or greenhouse gas emissions come from the manufacture of ammonia at the moment. Just to add some more dimension to the commercial focus, this is a graph produced by the Commonwealth Science Industry Research Organisation, the national government science and industry research body. They've actually looked at where where hydrogen prices will be over the next 10 years and what industry sectors actually fit a cost competitive play today or in the next 10 years. Now, the interesting thing there is we're already at the price point that they've picked for 2025. The tiles above the line around mobility in particular require a certain amount of infrastructure to be built, and they also require a level of fleet change. And so to get scale in those is a little bit harder because you'll deliver the sustained cost reductions through scale, and to get scale will be harder because you need infrastructure and you need to switch your fleets. But in the industrial feedstocks market, it's going too fast. In the industrial feedstocks market, the ability to produce at scale fairly cheap hydrogen will allow you the ability to bleed off into those mobility markets. Now, why are we producing ammonia? Probably the biggest driver of that is the ability to transport hydrogen as ammonia. There's a much higher density of hydrogen in terms of hydrogen per cubic metre in liquid ammonia than there is in liquid hydrogen. And the Japanese and Korean markets, which are traditional partners with Australia for energy out of the fossil fuel sector, so they have a strong relationship with Australia, have both decided quite sensibly that they will transition over a period of time from the current black, brown, whatever colour fuels you'd like to ascribe to fossil fuels to a more sustainable green fuels with a transition through blue if that's required. So the Japanese market in particular has a very comprehensive plan to transition their market, their energy market, into green ammonia as the fuel. And the proposal that the Japanese have is that they'll ship ammonia in because it's a viable and easily shipped commodity. They'll crack it in Japan and use it to fire their new fleets of combined cycle gas turbines that are hydrogen fueled. But in the interim, what they'll do is they'll use some existing mechanisms around penalty payments for inefficient, carbon inefficient generators, their older thermal fleet. And they'll use that as an incentive, or they already have that as an incentive to use green fuels. And so green ammonia injected as ammonia into the current coal-fired turbines is the transition which will allow them to build the receiving terminals, build up capability and ability to import. And then as those older coal units come to the end of their market life, they will phase them out and phase in new hydrogen turbines. And that's over the next sort of 30 years, between now and 2050. But they do have a very sensible plan for structuring that transition. So why ammonia? Look, at the moment, there is a substantial commodity market for ammonia. So the infrastructure is in place for transporting it. There's vessels. It is a major hydrogen user today, ammonia, although that hydrogen comes mostly from steam reform methane. But we do see that that shift to power generation in Japan will drive an entirely new market for energy ammonia, which they have specified they prefer to be green. And the other thing that we'll see driving the ammonia market is the zero emission shipping from the International Maritime Organisation. Their decision to, or the decision of the Getting to Zero Coalition is to try and use ammonia as a fuel and build the systems and transition that sensibly over the next 20 to 30 years. So that's what we're doing in Australia. We do see that we are very fortunate here because of our low population density and our very strong renewables. And the renewable energy zones tend to be in areas where there is a low population density, so the coexistence with agriculture rather than urban environments is much more helpful to shifting those sort of policy programs to get more renewables built. And we do expect to see that over the next 10 years, we will continue to substantially develop more and more renewables in this country. Therefore, the ability to create a market where we can export those renewables, and there's lots of terms being floated around Australia, shipping liquid sunshine and all those sorts of things, but being able to export renewables from a land that is well endowed to those that, and particularly our friends in the north, that have an energy need that they can't sustain themselves from renewables. The ability for us to ship to them makes a lot of sense, and we believe is commercially viable now, but will become more so in the next 10 years. So I'm not sure if there are any questions, but thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Tristram, and that was very good to hear your approach on this topic. Also speak about how Australia might see some prospects for indeed continuing its role as an energy exporter. Let me just, we have a couple of questions, comments here. Maybe you can, I think they were also related to the previous presentation, but maybe you would like to briefly answer them as well. One is brief one from Gadia Reli. What is the current cost of green versus grey hydrogen And the second one, there's quite, I think you can all read this here, from Michael Buxbaum, who asks, let me put it in my words to keep it short, who is worried about how hydrogen approach could become a Trojan horse for the traditional fossil sector to kind of continue their business models and then using blue, gray, whatever, hydrogen, but not renewable energy hydrogen. What can be done against it? So these are the two questions. Tristram, would you like to just comment on that?
Yeah, look, great questions. In terms of the cost of hydrogen, and again, it all comes down to the cost of energy, and we have some very good energy prices coming into our facilities. So we believe that at commissioning, the facility in South Australia on the Eyre Peninsula will deliver hydrogen at below $2 a kilo US, which is a target price for some, but that's where we'll sit now. At the moment, that's slightly higher than grey hydrogen in some areas of the globe. We're probably line ball with, or on par with, the production in Australia, because the gas prices here have gone up quite substantially, and because our hydrogen production the facilities are quite old. So they're not as efficient as if they were new grey hydrogen facilities. So at that level, the prices are on par. But the interesting thing here, and the important piece, is that the Japanese have been very clear. They're not interested in grey hydrogen. Their transition is about a decarbonisation program. And so they have specified that they will look at blue or green, and they've been very clear that blue is with CCS, where the carbon is sequestered and removed from the atmosphere. They don't seem at all interested in offsets as a path. So that kind of leads to the second question, which is the Trojan horse question. And I think this is again, great question, interesting concept. And it's just one of these things that you have to be vigilant against. I'm sure there will be some who will try and, greenwash or otherwise their existing facilities to keep them alive going forward. But the great thing is the market demand. And so, as Japan has been very clear that it's only interested in green, or if it is fossil derived, it must come with CCS. And from my perspective, CCS is a very good carbon price, because I've never found anyone who can do it cheaply yet. And so, and look, if you could effectively sequester and secure CO2, that is the dilemma, that is the problem, then we could live with it. But at the moment, that is not as easy thing to do, and it's not a cheap thing to do. So that, as a carbon price, actually makes green hydrogen much more attractive. I think where you'll see, some of that come through is you will see people try and substitute their electricity from non-renewable sources. And so there is an obligation on regulators, and particularly market regulators, to ensure that there is a level of guarantee of origin. And it's an area that we're working on quite deeply at the moment, is how you validate the credential of the green product. Now, it's easy enough for us to say, well, we only buy green power, therefore our product is green. But the molecules, like electrons, are highly fungible. How do you tell one from another? And really, I think the path to secure that is to have some kind of tradable mirror digital asset, if you like. And that's where blockchain technologies come in. So the ability to actually have a mirror digital asset to the molecule that is extinguished upon use or transformation of that molecule is where I think we need to sort of really put some effort. And that's something that, as I said, we're currently working on. But you can't stop fraudulent activity. You can only be wary of it and ensure that you prosecute a really strong argument against it when it occurs.
Very good. Good, thank you. So I understand you are confident that market forces will help at least. That's certainly something that also should be considered on the political level, in how to make sure that the hydrogen is not kind of making problems bigger. Again, thanks a lot to Australia and also contributing it for you rather late